She was standing in the middle of my shop like she owned it, which, I would later find out, she kind of did. Not the shop, but the building, the whole block, actually. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that it was a Tuesday morning in late October. The heat in the garage was still working its way up from cold overnight, and there was a woman in a navy coat standing next to a 1962 Steinway Model B grand piano that had just been rolled off a flatbed outside my door. She had her arms crossed, and she was looking at me the way people look at contractors they're not sure they can trust. Like I was already a disappointment that hadn't been confirmed yet. Her name was Laurel Ashby. No, wait, I need to back up. Because if I start there, you won't understand what that piano meant. And if you don't understand what that piano meant, none of the rest of this makes sense. My name is Garrett. Garrett Wynn. I'm 41 years old. I restore antique pianos for a living out of a two-bay workshop on the east side of Millhaven, Ohio. I've been doing it since I was 19, when a man named Bill Corrigan took me on as an apprentice, after finding me trying to fix a water-damaged upright in my mother's garage, with tools I'd borrowed from a neighbor and instructions I'd printed off a forum online. Bill was 62 then. He'd spent 30 years building a reputation as one of the best restoration specialists in the Midwest. He knew the difference between a Steinway and a Mason & Hamlin the way most people know the difference between a Toyota and a BMW. Not just by name, but by feel. By the particular resistance of the key, the way the sound bloomed in a room. He taught me everything, and when he retired 8 years ago, he sold me the shop for less than it was worth because, he said, he'd rather it go to someone who understood what it was for. I had a daughter. Her name was Reese. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's stubbornness and her grandfather's laugh. And she came to the shop with me most Saturdays because her grandmother, who usually watched her, had started having hip trouble, and the drive to drop her off added 30 minutes to my morning, and some weeks, that 30 minutes was the difference between making it work and not making it work. Reese didn't mind the shop. She liked the smell of the wood conditioner, and she'd learned to stay on the old leather couch by the window and do her reading while I worked. Sometimes, when I was doing the finish sanding on a soundboard, she'd wander over and watch with her chin in her hand, very serious, like a small inspector. Her mother had left when Reese was 2. I don't spend a lot of time on that part of the story. Some things just are what they are. What I will tell you is that being a single father is a specific kind of tired that doesn't go away. It settles into your bones. You get used to it the same way you get used to a bad knee. You stop noticing the ache until someone asks you to run, and then you remember all at once. That Tuesday morning in October, Reese was at school, and I had been at the bench since 6:30, working on a 1920 Bosendorfer that had come in from a university music department in Pittsburgh. The damper felts were compressed in the middle register. 2 hammer shanks had cracked at the flange, and someone at some point had apparently tried to regulate the action themselves, with results that I was still in the process of reversing. It was going to be a 2-week job at minimum. It was the kind of work I loved, the kind where every answer leads to another question. And you don't look up until you realize the light in the room has changed. I looked up when I heard the truck outside. The flatbed was from a moving company, not a piano transport specialist, which already told me something. You don't haul a grand piano on a moving truck unless you either don't know better or you don't care, and neither option is good. I walked out to the bay door still holding my regulation tool. The movers, 2 of them, big guys, moving fast, were already at the tailgate. The piano was aboard dolly and they had it blanketed but not crated, and when I saw the curve of the lid through the moving pads, I felt the same thing I always feel. A combination of anticipation and dread. That's when I noticed her. She was standing off to the side, on her phone, and she gave me a single glance when I walked out, and then looked back at her screen. She was tall, dark hair pulled back, somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s. The coat was the kind that cost more than most people spend on a car payment. "You're the restoration specialist," she said, not looking up. "I am? Garrett Wynn?" "That's right." She put the phone in her pocket then and looked at me fully for the first time. She had the kind of face that was used to being looked at and was not particularly interested in the experience. "I'm Laurel Ashby," she said. "I need this piano restored for my mother's birthday. She turns 72 in February. That gives you She checked her watch, a thing the size of a poker chip on her wrist. 16 weeks. What's the condition? It sat in a storage unit in Scottsdale for 11 years. I looked at the blanketed shape on the dolly. Arizona storage unit? Yes. Climate controlled? I was told it was. I don't know if I believe that. I nodded slowly. 11 years in a potentially unclimate-controlled storage unit in Arizona meant humidity damage, possibly cracked soundboard, definitely dead pin block, action parts that had either dried out and cracked or swollen and seized, depending on what the unit had actually been like. I didn't know what was under those blankets yet, but I had a feeling. Do you know the instrument's history? I asked. She paused just long enough for me to notice. It was my grandmother's. She bought it in 1971. My mother learned to play on it. My grandmother passed away in 2008, and it went into storage when we couldn't figure out what to do with it. She said this in the flat, efficient way people use when they're summarizing something that actually hurt. My mother has been talking about it every year since. I want it ready for her birthday. I'll need to do a full assessment before I can give you a timeline. I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm asking for your best. The movers were waiting. I waved them through to the second bay. What was under those moving pads was a 1962 Steinway Model B in ebonized walnut, with a bench that had lost 2 of its hinge screws and a lid prop that someone had replaced at some point with a wooden dowel that was clearly not original. The case had some surface scratching, a white ring on the fallboard from what I guessed was a glass set down on it sometime in the 90s, and a small crack running about 4 inches from the base end of the rim. I put on my inspection light and opened the lid. The soundboard had a hairline fracture running diagonally through the treble section. Not catastrophic. Repairable. The pin block. The block of laminated maple the tuning pins sit in was dry, and I could already see that several pins had loosened, which meant the piano couldn't hold a tune for more than a few days even if I tuned it today. The strings were original, which meant they were 62 years old, which meant they were almost certainly going to need replacing. I leaned in close to the bass section where the plate meets the rim, and I looked at the area around the string holes, the way I always do, just out of habit. That's when I stopped. There was a mark on the underside of the plate. Not a stamp, more like a handwritten notation in black marker, partially faded, in a corner that you'd only see if you were looking for it. Most people wouldn't look there. Most people wouldn't look there. Corrigan Restoration, Millhaven OH, 1994. Bill's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere. I straightened up slowly. My back was to Laurel Ashby. I stood there for a moment just looking at the notation, and I felt something move in my chest. Bill had died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. It had been fast. I'd been to the funeral, and I'd stood in the back of the church because I couldn't trust myself to sit closer to the family. Bill had touched this piano. 29 years before I was standing here, Bill had opened this same plate, assessed this same instrument, and written his name on it the way he always did. Quietly, in a place no one would see, because he said documentation wasn't about credit, it was about continuity. So the next person who worked on the piano would know. I was next person. I closed the lid carefully and turned around. When was the last time this piano was serviced? I asked. Laurel Ashby looked up from her phone. I have no idea. Before storage? Do you know if it was restored at any point? My grandmother had work done on it, years ago. I don't know when. Do you have any records? Receipts, invoices, anything from a restoration specialist? She frowned. I doubt it. She wasn't. My grandmother kept some things and not others. Why? I looked at her for a moment. The piano was worked on by someone in the mid-90s. I can see his mark on the plate. He was based in Millhaven. She was quiet for a second. Is that a problem? No, I said. Not at all. It actually tells me a lot about how the work was done and what to expect when I get into the action. I paused. The man who did that restoration, his name was Bill Corrigan. He was my mentor. He taught me this trade. Laurel Ashby looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, just slightly. Not warmth exactly. That's a coincidence, she said. Yeah, I said. It is. I gave her the assessment by email 2 days later. Full restring, pin block replacement, soundboard crack repair, action regulation and voicing, case refinishing of the scratched areas, bench restoration. Estimated cost, $14,000. Estimated timeline, 10 to 12 weeks, which would put completion in mid to late January and leave a few weeks of buffer before the February birthday. I sent it at 9:30 in the evening after Reese was asleep, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. It was the kind of quote that made my stomach tight even after 20 years. Not because it wasn't fair, but because $14,000 is $14,000, and sometimes people see a number like that and decide they'd rather buy a new piano. Her response came at 11:15 that same night. Approved. When can you start? I started the following Monday. The first few weeks were straightforward in the way that complicated work is sometimes straightforward. It had its own logic, its own sequence, and I moved through it the way I'd been trained. I pulled the action. I removed the strings. I documented everything with photos, the way Bill had taught me, before touching anything that couldn't be untouched. It was during the pin block removal, about 3 weeks in, that I found the second thing. I had the plate off, the cast iron frame that the strings are attached to, which, in a piano this age, required careful technique to lift without stressing the rim, and I was cleaning out the space underneath in preparation for fitting the new pin block. I was using a light and a dental pick to clear out decades of dust and debris from the corners, which is not glamorous work, and I was listening to a basketball game on the radio, and I almost missed it. It was a folded piece of paper, wedged between the old pin block and the inner rim of the case. Not a manufacturing artifact, not documentation. It was folded twice, the paper yellowed and dry, and when I unfolded it carefully under my work light, I saw that it was a letter. Handwritten, 2 pages, both sides. The date at the top was September 14, 1994. I shouldn't have read it. I knew that. It wasn't mine to read. But I was also the only person who knew it existed, and I needed to make a decision about what to do with it, and to make that decision I had to know what it was. I read the first 3 lines. My darling Eleanor, I know I said I wouldn't write again. I know what we agreed, but I've been sitting in this house for 6 months thinking about what I should have said that last night, and I can't carry it anymore. I stopped. I refolded the paper. I set it on the workbench and I looked at it for a long moment. This was a love letter, hidden inside a piano. For 30 years, the piano had been worked on in 1994. Bill had been the one who worked on it, which meant that whoever had hidden this letter had hidden it while the piano was in for restoration, or possibly Bill himself had found it and refiled it, though that didn't sound like him. Bill was methodical. If he'd found something, he would have returned it. More likely, someone had hidden it while the piano was out of the house, put it somewhere they thought it would never be found, or somewhere they thought it would eventually be found, by the right person, at the right time. Eleanor. I sat there for a long time. I thought about Reese. I thought about the way she sometimes came to the shop on a Saturday and just sat near me, not talking, just being in the same room. I thought about the particular kind of loneliness that is specific to having a lot of people around you and still feeling like there's nobody in the room who knows what you're carrying. And then I called Laurel Ashby. It went to voicemail. I left a message that said there was something she needed to know about, and could she call me back when she had a chance. I kept my voice neutral. I didn't say what it was. She called back in 40 minutes. What's wrong with the piano? Nothing's wrong with it. The work is going fine. But I found something during the restoration that I think belongs to your family. A pause. What kind of something? A letter, hidden inside the case between the pin block and the rim. It's handwritten, dated 1994. It's addressed to someone named Eleanor. The silence on the other end was long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. That's my grandmother's name, she said finally. I thought it might be. Another silence, then. What does it say? I only read the first 3 lines before I stopped. It's a love letter. I think it should be for your family to read, not me. I heard her exhale. It was the first time she'd sounded like some other than a person managing a transaction. Can I come by? She said. Whenever you want. She came the next evening, alone. She was in different clothes. Dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, her hair down. She looked like a different person. Or maybe just more of the same person. I had the letter in a clean archival sleeve I used for documents sitting on the workbench next to the project notes. I handed it to her without a word. She sat on the stool I kept near the bench and she read it. I went to the other side of the shop and pretended to check something on the Bosendorfer. I wasn't pretending very well. But I tried. When I looked back, she was on the second page. She wasn't crying. She was very still, the kind of still that comes just before something, and I gave her space. After a few minutes, she folded the letter and held it in both hands in her lap. "My grandmother never married," she said. "She was my mother's mother. My mother's father was a man my grandmother was with briefly before I was born. She never talked about him." She paused. "She never talked about anyone. You don't have to explain it to me." "I know." She looked down at the letter. "She bought this piano herself in 1971. She paid for it with money she'd saved for 3 years. She told my mother once that it was the thing in her life she was most proud of owning." She turned the letter over in her hands. She must have hidden this during the restoration. That's my guess, too. Why would she hide it inside the piano? I thought about that. Maybe because the piano was the safest place she knew. Laurel Ashby looked at me then. Really looked at me the way she hadn't in that first meeting in the bay. She looked like she was trying to figure out whether I was a person or just someone who was useful to her for the next few months. I didn't say anything. I let her look. "You could have not told me," she said. "You could have just refiled it and said nothing." "I know. Why didn't you?" I thought about Bill, about the way he'd always said that a piano restorer's job wasn't just to fix the mechanical parts, it was to preserve the whole history of the instrument. The dents and the repairs and the modifications and the things people had left behind. "Because it wasn't mine to decide what to do with," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother is going to fall apart when she reads this, maybe," I said. "Or maybe she's been waiting for it." That was November. The work continued through December. The piano was coming back. The new pin block was fitted and pinned. The new strings were installed and brought up to rough pitch. The soundboard crack had been reinforced from the interior and was holding. The action was out on the bench. All 88 sets of parts, cleaned and rebuilt and regulated. And the hammers had been voiced once already and would need a second voicing after final tuning. It was good work. I could feel it the way you feel it when everything is moving the right direction. Laurel Ashby started coming by the shop, not for any particular reason. She'd text first, "Are you at the shop?" And I'd say yes, and half an hour later she'd show up with 2 coffees from the place on 5th Street. She'd sit on the stool near the bench and ask questions while I worked. Not surface questions, real ones. How did I know when a string was seated properly? What was the difference in sound between a rebuilt hammer and a new one? Why did the pedal mechanism need to be re-regulated even if it wasn't broken? I answered them. I'm not much of a talker ordinarily, but there's something about explaining work you love that loosens something in your chest. I found myself going into more detail than I usually would. She listened the way people don't always listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, actually tracking what I was saying. I found out, across those weeks, that she had built her company from a 2-person consulting firm into something with 43 employees. That she had a younger brother she was estranged from. That she had been married once, in her early 30s, for 4 years, and she didn't explain what happened, and I didn't ask. That she'd moved back to Millhaven 8 months ago after 15 years in Chicago because her mother's health had started to be a concern. She found out that Reese existed when Reese showed up one Saturday in December and climbed over the shop gate because I'd forgotten to tell her I had a visitor. Reese stood in the bay door in her winter coat, backpack on, holding a library book about the life cycle of monarch butterflies, and looked at Laurel with the frank assessment of a second grader. "Are you the piano lady?" Reese said. Laurel looked at me. "Is that what you call me?" "That's what she calls you," I said. "Yes," Laurel told Reese. "I guess I'm the piano lady." Reese nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to the leather couch and opened her book. That was a Thursday. Laurel had stopped by on her way somewhere else, she'd said. But she didn't leave for another 2 hours. There was a week in January that I almost didn't make it. Not the piano. The piano was fine. I almost didn't make it, practically. The Bosendorfer from Pittsburgh had taken longer than expected, and the client had been difficult about the revised timeline, and I'd had to put 2 weeks of supply costs on a credit card I'd been trying to pay down, and the heating system in the shop decided that January in Ohio was a good time to start making a sound like a trapped animal. Reese had an ear infection. She missed 4 days of school. I'd taken 2 days off to be home with her, and those 2 days had cost me time I didn't have. I was at the bench on a Thursday night at 11:30, Reese asleep upstairs at my mother's house 2 blocks over, where we'd been staying since my apartment lease had ended in November, and the next place wasn't ready until February. My hands were tired and I kept having to stop and stretch them. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. I want to be clear about that. This is just what it is. You keep your head down and you work and you figure it out. That's what you do. But that night I sat back on my stool and I looked at the Steinway. Fully strung now. The action back in the case, the voicing nearly finished, starting to look like what it was going to be. And I thought about Bill. I thought about how he'd touched this same instrument in 1994, when I was 12 years old, and how he couldn't have known that it would come back to his shop 30 years later for me to find. I thought about Eleanor, who had hidden a letter inside the safest thing she owned. I thought about the way Reese had looked at the piano last Saturday. She'd asked me to play something. I'd sat down and played the first thing I could remember, a Chopin nocturne I'd learned years ago, badly, but well enough. And she'd sat on the bench beside me and leaned her head against my arm without saying anything. That moment cost me nothing. It wasn't in any part of the math I was trying to do about heat bills and credit cards and lease dates. But it was the only part of that week that I knew I'd remember. I went back to work. I finished the voicing on a Monday in late January. Final regulation on Wednesday. Final tuning, 3 rounds over 3 days to let the strings settle. Completed the following Friday. I played through it slowly, not performing, just listening, starting in the bass and moving up through the registers, playing single notes first, then intervals, then chords. The soundboard sang. The action was even and responsive. The tone in the middle register had that particular warmth that the best Model Bs have, a kind of cushioned resonance that you feel slightly below the sternum if the room is quiet and you're paying attention. I played the opening of the Chopin nocturne I'd played for Reese. It sounded right. It sounded like what it was supposed to be. I sat there for a little while after I stopped playing, in the quiet of the shop, with the winter light coming through the high windows on the east side, and I thought, Bill would have liked this one. Laurel came to the shop 2 days later for the final walkthrough. She was with her mother. Her mother's name was Patricia, no. Wait. Her mother's name was Sonja Ashby, 69 years old, a retired music teacher, gray-haired and small-framed and moving carefully because of the hip she'd had replaced the year before. She came in through the bay door and she saw the piano from 15 feet away, and she stopped walking. She didn't say anything, she just looked at it. Laurel was watching her mother. I was watching Laurel. After a moment, Sonja walked to the piano. She touched the fallboard first, ran her fingers along the edge of the case. Then she sat down on the bench and opened the keys and placed her hands on the keys without playing. Just held them there. "Hi," she said quietly. I don't know if she was talking to me or to the piano. She played something. I didn't recognize it at first. Something classical, slow, in a minor key. Then I placed it. Brahms, one of the intermezzi. She played it from memory, with the ease of someone who had played it 1,000 times, and the piano answered her exactly the way it should. She stopped after a few minutes. She was crying, quietly, without making any effort to hide it or apologize for it. Laurel had her hand on her mother's shoulder. I went to the other side of the shop. Before Sonja left, she found me and shook my hand with both of hers. She said, "You gave me back something I thought was gone." She said it simply, the way people say the things they really mean, without decoration, without preamble. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "It's a remarkable instrument. It deserved to be heard." After Sonja's car had pulled out, Laurel stayed. She leaned against the workbench with her arms crossed, not looking at me, looking at the space where the piano had been. She read the letter, she said. How did she take it? She cried for about an hour. Then she said she needed a few days. Laurel paused. The man who wrote it, she knew who it was. She recognized the handwriting from one photograph she had of a birthday card. She'd never known his name. My grandmother never told her. Did the letter have a name, a first name? Marcus. She shook her head slowly. 60 years and a first name. We stood there for a while. I was straightening my tools, something to do with my hands. "I owe you more than what I paid you," she said. "You paid the invoice. That's not what I mean." She looked at me. "You could have kept that letter. Or thrown it away. Or, I don't know. Most people wouldn't have called. Most people would have just decided it wasn't their problem. It's like I told you, I said. It wasn't mine to decide. She was quiet again. The heat in the shop ticked and settled. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure, are you? She started, and then stopped, and I could see her deciding how to say it. I've been coming here every week for 3 months. I think you know that hasn't entirely been about the piano. I set down the regulation tool I'd been holding. I turned around and leaned against the bench the way she was leaning, both of us looking at the same space. I know, I said, and you didn't say anything. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. She looked at me. What would the wrong thing have been? I thought about that. I thought about Reese, who had started asking me last month whether the piano lady was going to come back after the piano was finished. I thought about the way I'd been leaving the coffee cups on the workbench after Laurel left, just leaving them there for a couple of hours before I threw them away, like some evidence of a thing I didn't want to lose. I don't know, I said honestly. I've just been careful. You're always careful, she said, not unkindly. I have a daughter, I said. I know you do. She told me about monarch butterflies for 45 minutes in December. I laughed. It surprised me, the sound of it in the quiet shop. Laurel smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile like that. Not polished, not composed, just a real smile that got ahead of her and she let it. I'm not asking you for anything specific, she said. I'd like to keep having coffee in this shop, if that's something you'd be open to. I looked at her for a moment. The winter light was still in the high windows. The bench was clear. The Bosendorfer was finished and gone. The next job, a 1951 Baldwin upright from a church in Dayton, was scheduled to arrive next week. I make the coffee here, I said. It's not as good as Fifth Street. I know, she said. It's still better than sitting alone. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to. There are some things you don't need words for, and I'd learned that mostly from 7 years of being someone's only parent. You learn to read the air in a room. You learn what presence means and what absence costs. Next Tuesday, I said. She pushed off from the bench, picked up her coat. Tuesday, she said. She was almost to the door when I said, the man who restored that piano before me, Bill Corrigan. He used to say that every instrument carries the history of everyone who ever played it. Not recorded, not visible, just present, in the way the wood has moved, the way the action has worn, the way the tone has settled over time. Laurel stopped. I used to think he was being sentimental, I said. I don't anymore. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The cold came in off the street and I could see the pale gray of the February afternoon behind her. Tell Reese I hope she liked the butterfly book, she said. Then she was gone. I stood in the empty shop for a while. I thought about Bill. I thought about Eleanor, who had hidden a letter inside the thing she loved most, and how 30 years later it had found the hands it was always meant to find. I thought about Reese asking me last Saturday night, in her pajamas, brushing her teeth, unprompted, Dad, is it weird to like someone you don't know that well? And I'd said no. I think that's usually how it starts. She'd spit out her toothpaste and thought about that for a second. Okay, she'd said. Then she'd gone to bed. I turned off the bench light. I put on my coat. I checked the lock on the bay door the way I check it every night. Once, then again, a habit I'd had for years. And I walked out into the February cold. The street was quiet. 3 blocks over, I could hear a train. I put my hands in my pockets and I walked home.